Okay, so it looks like we're right at the top of the hour here, and in the interest of taking the most advantage of this 90-minute session, I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. This is the ESIP Winter Meeting 2022 session on the Earth and Space Science Knowledge Commons. Really excited to have everyone online today, particularly excited because of how diverse and plural the discussion will be. We've been deliberate in the design of this session and trying to invite people that may not traditionally be people who participate in the ESIP meeting to broaden the perspectives on what we think of as knowledge representation systems and ways for us to interact as a community. My name's Ryan McGranigan. I'm one of a number of conveners that you see listed here that have been speaking with each other over the past year or so about what this idea of a knowledge commons means. And I know that this connects to a lot of different currents that are going on in the ESIP community. And so we're really excited to have this be kind of a broad discussion. The first thing I would like to do is share with you some key resources for contributing today. So the first is the session notes, which are online. You can go there and add your contact information and let people know that you dropped in here so we can stay in touch afterwards. And then second is going to be a Miro board, which is a great place for us to kind of brainstorm in a non-linear way and have your questions put out there to the panel session that we're going to be leading today. So I did want to start with a land acknowledgement. I think it's very important, and you heard the plenary session this morning, which I thought framed this very well, but I'm speaking to you from the Washington, D.C. area, and I'll acknowledge that that's the traditional territory of the Nacotchtank and the Nacostawan and Piscataway people. We acknowledge this legacy and can find inspiration from this land. And you can use the link here, nativeland.ca, to explore the native lands in your area. By acknowledging territory or land, we may recognize Indigenous presence as we convene for the ESIP Winter Meeting this week. We each have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism in our history as a nation and as a community. Throughout the discussion during this session and throughout this whole winter meeting, we note the privileges we enjoy today because of colonialism, and we strive to not perpetuate colonial futurity. So I'm going to begin by speaking about how Earth and space science data have become entangled in every facet of our lives. These data have become the very foundation of our discovery of the universe that surrounds us and the place that we have within it. And in this year and in the past, perhaps greater than at any other time, access to these data and indeed the space environment is at our fingertips. And it feels that we may even be at the very cusp of an interplanetary civilization. But at the same time, our expansion into space and our expansion into the depths of the Earth exemplify the increasing interconnections that we have between the Earth, our lives, and the space environment. And so the key point is that as our society expands technologically and physically in our exploration of the Earth and space sciences, our flourishing has become inextricable from these data sets. And the data and knowledge infrastructures that we have not kept pace with the rapid change that we have in our data sets. So what we're here to do today is to take the pre-step to a solution to that, something that we've been thinking of in this notion of an Earth and space science knowledge commons, which we describe or define as a combination of intelligent information representation and the openness, governance, and trust required to create a participatory ecosystem whereby the whole community maintains and evolves the shared information space. We believe that a knowledge commons is kind of a culmination of a natural progression that we see within ESIP, which is modeling within knowledge graphs individual domains of connected information, progressing those knowledge graphs to be interlinked to one another, and that becomes a knowledge network. And then when we converge the technological and the cultural components, that's what we think of as a knowledge community. And that's what a knowledge commons is really focused on. We believe that a knowledge commons is a core technology defined both as the hardware and software and the cultural technologies of the solution for a more inclusive, open, and equitable Earth and space community. In this participatory ecosystem, the whole community is responsible for maintaining that and evolving that shared space. This session is central to the focus of this entire ESIP meeting, which is data for all people from generation to use and understanding. Over the past few months, a group of us that cuts across NASA, the American Geophysical Union, the MIT Knowledge Futures Group, industry, and academia have been actively exploring the concept of an Earth and space science knowledge commons. And we're excited to kind of bring that to the ESIP community this week. So I just wanted to mention that there are a couple of animating questions that I think give this a little bit of concreteness, and I wanted to put in everyone's minds as we got started today. That's how can we better understand the resources, the people, capabilities, assets, contents, data, models, whatever else that we would consider a resource that's available about the Earth and space science. And the second is, to what extent is cohesion the key to a more flourishing community? So our group today is going to be a singular group of people that are actively working on projects that span this space and can uncommonly represent the diversity of Earth and space science knowledge today. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what the session will be, and then I'm going to step out of the way and let the far more knowledgeable and capable individuals that we've invited to be a part of this discussion carry the conversation. So our aims today are first to bring together a new community to discuss intelligent data infrastructure for the Earth and space sciences, and to build on some foundations that we've created. One that I wanted to point to was a Step Zero framework, a virtual workshop that we led, and you can find the link in the slides, of a knowledge commons. And I've already mentioned what that is, but I think you can find some more information about that discussion there. We want specifically to create the network of people and active projects for this space so that we can continue to interact, and then create a repository for resources for all participants, every one of you, to use for connection and ideas beyond the workshop. That will include the notes, useful data sets, and new essays in a open access publishing platform space that we've created on PubPub. And I encourage you to take a look there. And really an outcome of this workshop will be, hopefully, that each of you will be inspired to contribute your personal experiences, essays, pieces of various sorts to that collection and have that be a living conversation that goes on around this. So just an idea of what we think success looks like for this. To first, spread the literacy of knowledge graphs, knowledge networks, and knowledge communities or commons. You're going to hear from panel members who are able to do that on a number of different dimensions to create a more capacious understanding of the diversity that exists in Earth and space science knowledges and data sets. To form a new community of practice that thinks about the Earth and space science knowledge commons and broadens participation in that vision. And this community of practice is really something we're going to focus on during this meeting and in the steps that follow this ESIP workshop session. We want to also help us to identify the key dimensions of Earth and space science data. So you could think of this in terms of how would a researcher, or what would a researcher like to search over? What capabilities exist now and what may not yet be available that are important? And then also to crystallize, again, our discussion in the PubPub space collection page. So how are we going to do it today? We're going to do it in a number of different steps. So I'm going to finish this introduction in just a moment. And the first thing that we're going to do is here kind of a fishbowl. We're describing as a fishbowl conversation between Caroline Coward, Ellie Young, and S.J. Klein about framing what a knowledge commons is. We're going to give you a little more background from people who have really pioneered some of the work in this space. Then we're going to spend just a moment to look at the Miro board and have you write your animating questions that can kind of bring energy to the session and things that we'll address with the panelists. Then we're going to hear from a panel with pioneers of knowledge commons across a number of dimensions that we've identified. And then finally, we're going to revisit animating questions as we move to some calls to action from Claudia Pozzo and building a community of practice that Chris Erdman will be speaking about towards the end of the session. So I'm going to pause here. I'm just going to put the dimensions that we've identified as very important up on the screen. And I will do the introduction to the panel members after we hear from Caroline, Ellie, and SJ. And just let you take a look at these dimensions that we'll be talking about and have those in your mind. So with that, I will stop sharing here and I will hand it over to Ellie, Caroline, and SJ.
Great, thank you, Ryan. I'll jump in if no one has a, okay, great. So my background, it sort of spans knowledge graphs and earth science. I was a previous head of community at the Knowledge Graph conference where I got to learn about all of the nitty gritty kind of technical details. And I'm now founding Common Action, which is an initiative to bring knowledge graphs into a knowledge commons for climate change action. And I think, sort of the interesting thing to point out is knowledge graphs as a technology skills or a toolkit were developed out of academia by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, no one else but the creator of the web. And what he was able to see at that early stage, which was, about 20 years ago now, was the beginning of this problem that Ryan sort of described and we're all kind of in, which is the explosion of information that's been brought to us by automated methods of creating and distributing that. So, they published a paper in 2001 called the Semantic Web, and they outlined this really wild scientific science fiction idea back then, which was that you could get a schedule automatically linked up between yourself and your dentist through metadata, right? This magical machine readable tagging system. And, everyone kind of thought that was far-fetched, and no one wanted to do metadata back then. And so the semantic web kind of academic technology fell a little bit into the wayside. But we're now seeing a resurgence with the Knowledge Graph Conference, as I mentioned, creating itself 3 years ago to focus on bringing the toolkit to industry. Gartner has called, I think, year 2020 and 2021 the year of the graph. The NSF has the Open Knowledge Network track. There's all of these enterprises that are exploring this toolkit, and the primary kind of push between all of these factors that I'm sure we can all relate to is an increasing complexity in information and in the context that we're in and in our own action and organizational situation. So, how does the right person get the right piece of information? This is no longer a trivial question. I'm sure we're all familiar with, the COVID. There was this article, I think in May last year, or 2020, which explained that in the last 2 months or the first 2 months of COVID, we had already published 60,000 papers, which obviously goes beyond, human scale. So we need to start to think about how to bring these automated tools into people workflows and how to connect what the information producers and searchers and users are doing and making alongside the cultural activity protocols that actually guide the way that we work and so on. So that's sort of, my concept of the knowledge commons. We're trying to bring that into a wild context with, the various folks that are involved in climate action and should be involved in climate action. And there's many more folks that have far more experience with real projects on the line that I'm excited to hear from. So Caroline, please.
Thanks, Ellie. That was great. Wonderful introduction. I'm Caroline Coward. I'm head of the library at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. But today I'm really representing librarians and information scientists and researchers from everywhere. And I'm here to talk about the concept of a community of practice, how a community of practice evolves out of a community of interest, adding the action piece through a very rather organic process. I want to talk a little bit about my own involvement in the data citation community of practice and how that came about, and maybe using that as a model for our own knowledge graph community here. This started back in December of 2020. Because of COVID, the American Geophysical Union fall meeting that year was fully online. And I hadn't submitted a paper, and I was kind of lurking and trolling a couple of the sessions where people were talking about things of interest to me, namely citing data sets in the peer-reviewed literature. A number of my librarians were actually working with one of our DAC managers on uncovering citations of data sets of that particular repository, and finding it very, very difficult because people were citing all different ways. There really was no model, no standardized way of doing it at that time. People might be specific, might be general, they might spell out the acronym, they might keep the acronym, they might just say NASA data. And so evidently there was a lot of energy around this topic in December of 2020 at AGU, because I was able to watch and lurk and participate in a couple of talks. And especially I was monitoring the chat in these talks because it was all on Zoom and there was an active chat discussion going on. And I noticed some common themes bubbling up, and I began to, in my mind, classify and categorize them as a librarian does. And I started thinking, hey, it would be a real shame if this very rich and active discussion in the chat were to be lost. Because this was December of 20, this was pandemic 1.0, and we were all still kind of learning how to do Zoom meetings and realizing, oh, you got to save the chat because there's really good stuff going on there. So I started dropping messages into the chat saying, hey, who's saving this? Are we going to continue this discussion? We really should continue discussion after the conference, because we're not solving any problems here. We're not even offering any real super substantive discussion. People are kind of kvetching that, I can't find my data, or I don't know how to cite my data. So after about 4 or 5 of these individual talks and panels and presentations, I began to occur to me, all of these people, we really kind of need to stay together. So I started dropping into the chat my email address, my personal email address, and saying, hey, hit me up if you guys want to continue the conversation post AGU. And I was delighted and surprised to get about 60 responses just from 4 or 5 different sessions. And so I started a Google Doc and put everybody's email address on the Google Doc and said, hey, and responded to everybody individually and said, hey, you sent me your email address. Let's keep talking about this data citation problem. And I recruited a couple of friends of mine, Chris Erdman and Shelley Stahl from AGU, Deb Agarwal from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, a couple other people, and said, you guys were giving talks and really discussing this. Let's have a more substantive, a more cohesive discussion about how to solve this problem. So I want to offer that as kind of step number 1 in Community of Practice 101. There has to be a concrete problem to solve. Whether it's very specific or whether it's rather general, there needs to be sort of a shared goal, a shared pain point, a shared problem to solve. Ours was citation of data sets in the literature. So we had sort of an initial coalescing meeting deciding, okay, how are we going to attack this? What do we want to do? And we decided a couple of pronged efforts. We wanted to keep the conversation going through workshops. We wanted to invite more people who had a stake in this. And we wanted to kind of reevaluate things after 8 or 9 months. So the workshop aspect came together very quickly. Okay, we're going to essentially throw an online party and see who shows up. We're going to state the problem and state maybe not solutions, but here are some pathways to solve the problem. And we had our first workshop early in 2021. About 75 people showed up, which was really, really exciting. And things have just kind of mushroomed from there. So through Shelley and Chris and Deb, they brought in their friends and colleagues, publishers, researchers, librarians, scientists, grad students, anyone who with a vested interest in solving the data citation problem. And the community, the list has grown. Deb has taken it upon herself to really introduce the first part of that research and to kind of run the workshops. And Shelley and Chris have really moved things along in terms of bringing more stakeholders together. We have an active sort of steering group of people from all different walks. And it's really exciting to see how this thing has turned out. We've done 3 workshops so far focusing on more granular aspects of the problem. So as I said, so step number 1 is define the problem, is you have to have sort of a shared pain point, shared problem. Step 2 is you can go more specific, more granular in that. See how your community is shaking out. Who have you brought in? What kinds of messages are they bringing in? What kinds of pain points are they bringing in? What do they want to talk about? And let it sort of grow a bit organically with some direction. I'm not saying just to turn people loose and do whatever they're going to do. Have some direction around it. Make sure you're still working on the problem, but depending on the different voices in the room, that can guide the direction of solving the problem. And so we've had, like I said, 3 or so workshops. We're planning a 4th. We've had some small group meetings about how to move forward. It's really, really exciting. The next thing we wanted to do, something that I wanted to do, was add to the body of literature in this area. There really wasn't a whole lot on information science or data science communities of practice. So I thought, let's go legit. Let's actually maybe get some journal articles, some research out of this. We're still working on that, but really codifying and formalizing what you're doing. So you still have this kind of organic community, but get your word out there, and so people can use this as a model and really kind of take it and make it what they're going to make of it. I mentioned at the outset, moving from a community of interest to a community of practice. What I was doing at trolling at AGU 2020 was really kind of identifying community of interest. Who's interested in this? Who wants to talk about this? But moving to a practice really infuses action, decision-making, really more concrete steps. And so these are all practitioners in the field and moving people in the same direction to solve the problem. So I find that really, really exciting. After this is the last point I'm going to make. The next thing to do is sort of reevaluate where you are 8 months, a year into it, if it lasts that long. So we are actually over a year into this effort. And now I'm starting to think, okay, data citation community of practice 2.0. What does that look like? What have we accomplished so far? What are the questions that still remain to be answered? What are some real sticky points, the pieces of the problem that we just can't, we're taking a hammer and chisel to them and it just isn't working? Who else do we need to bring into the mix? And what else can we do to help the situation, to help solve the problem on a 50,000-foot level? And I'm really looking forward to talking with my co-conspirators about this, Shelley and Deb and Chris and everyone else on the team. And if you want to join the data citation community of practice, if you too have a problem either uncovering your data in the literature or citing data in the literature, shoot me an email. I put my email address on the Google Doc, and I will add you to the list and you will be on the mailing list for the next workshop. And we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear what your possible solutions are to the problem. I'm handing it off to SJ. Is SJ here?
Thanks, Caroline. That's really a great framing. And Ellie, I loved your grounding of why this is so important in the early dreams of how to interconnect anything into a web. I think we are just starting to realize some of the real power of having an interconnected society of knowledge. I'm at the Knowledge Futures group where we work on tools for publishing and federating knowledge graphs, but I'm also a Wikipedian. And I want us to spend some of our time today thinking about how to build a commons that scales with the complexity of its knowledge. And this is one of the challenges the Semantic Web tried to address by distributing the task of describing the structure of things. But just broadcasting the structure of knowledge isn't always enough to build coherence. And 2 other things that have become increasingly important are maintaining shared context. A lot of us get that context from search engines or from commercial knowledge graphs that provide an anchor for our other work. But if you're relying on a black box graph to anchor your reasonably public commons, that's an opportunity for intermediation. It's a way to allow power laws to drown out smaller, interesting, new sources of knowledge. So it's essential to have, as part of the commons, the landscape that tells you what's in it. And the other thing is we need the landscape to be truly collaborative. We have Wikidata today as a global knowledge graph, even though it's mostly focused on general knowledge. It includes all sorts, and it's something anyone can update. And while I'm speaking to you right now, each of you in the audience could add a new entity to it or find one and update it. And there's a lovely session on Wikidata as a potential framework for Earth Science Work on Friday, which I hope you'll all watch. But today, let's think about what other aspects of a collaborative knowledge commons we need that we don't have yet, either because we have it but it's not open, or it's open but it can't be curated by a sufficiently open group that the curation itself scales as the tasks at hand scale. Brian, back to you.
Thank you, SJ. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Caroline. I think it's a wonderful framing for this session. And I know that I have a lot of questions on my mind and a lot of things I'd like to continue to pull on threads of. And I think that the best way to do that is to maybe move into the panel session, which is going to introduce 5 fantastic individuals who've been working in this space. And I want to emphasize that this will be very much an open discussion. So we're going to kind of lead that with some introductory remarks from the panel members. But I would encourage everyone to use the Miro board, which I've just posted a link to post your questions that you want to see discussed and that you want to see the conversation move towards. We'll get to as many of those as we can. And then the ones that we're not able to get to, we will have follow-on virtual meetings, much in the ilk that Caroline described, to explore some of these things. So what I wanted to do quickly was to do a quick demo here. Are people able to see my screen, particularly the Miro board?
Yes.
Great, thank you, Ian. So what I've done is you can open up the Miro board here, and you're going to, if you're new to Miro, I just want to make sure you're comfortable with this. I created kind of a practice space over here. So if you would like to just become familiar, you're able to use this space. If you want to post a Post-it note, this is the best way to put a question up. Just click on sticky note on the left, click on the color that you'd like to use, and then type in whatever you'd like to there. And you can direct it towards a specific speaker, or you can direct it towards the panel as a whole. And you can use this practice space to kind of do whatever you'd like there. There's a lot of capability within Miro board, which is nice. But this is a good place to practice. Then as the session goes on, you can do this at any time. You can go over to the 2 colored areas that we've put together here. So this first one on the left, the orange area, is what we're calling animating questions, the things that are that brought you to this session and that you'd like to see explored. So you can put your Post-it notes there at any time. And then at the very end of the session, we're going to revisit this and have people post what came to mind to them throughout the course of this session. So I encourage you to kind of continue to think about that as we go. And we're going to, again, conclude with a call to action. And in Caroline's really nice words, move from a community of interest to a community of practice. So I'm going to now go over to our panel introductions. And I have a slide for each panel speaker. And what I'm going to do is, as I come to that slide, I'll give the floor to the panel speaker to share their thoughts in their quick 2 to 3 minute introduction. These are the dimensions, as I mentioned before, that we're really interested to explore. These are kind of key dimensions that we've identified for what it takes to build a knowledge commons. And so you'll see that there are a lot of things that we'll speak to during this session and beyond. So our first panel speaker is Hilary Hanaho, who's the Secretary General of the Research Data Alliance. And Hilary, I will leave your quick bio that we've written here up and hand it over to you for a quick introduction.
Thanks very much, Ryan. And thanks to you and to the conveners for inviting me to speak. Of course, we have a long-standing relationship with ESIP as one of our organizational members in the Research Data Alliance. So it's very nice to actually be directly involved in one of your meetings. I had to wait to go online for that, I'm afraid, but fingers crossed we'll get back to the in-person meetings as well again, which is actually quite a fundamental thing for what you're talking about. We can work, of course, very well globally and virtually, as we do in the Research Data Alliance, but part of the policy and governance, which is the aspect I'm going to cover. I think also trust would be the third one, is really important with, you know, the interconnections and the social connections. So a really quick brief word on the Research Data Alliance, though I do see many of the participants are members, which is wonderful. But it was launched in 2013 as a result of a sort of a perceived need for more and better infrastructure to support data-driven research efforts across the world. And I mean, the vision for the Research Data Alliance is researchers and innovators who openly share and reuse data across technologies, across disciplines, and across countries. So truly global, cross-disciplinary, encompassing all research and science domains and aspects, and of course, all different types of data challenges. And the mission, I think, is important because piece of it, which is building the bridges that can, the social and the technical bridges that can enable that data sharing and reuse. And it's the social part, of course, we in the Research Data Alliance feel is as important, in fact, and to get to the, if you like, the successes or the objectives that we have, the creating the social connections is really important. So it's good to hear this cultural dimension that you keep mentioning, Ryan. Before I move into the, like, just a few words on each of those three areas, policy, governance, and trust, it's important, I think, to underline the fact that RDA operates with 6 fundamental guiding principles. They're openness, consensus, inclusivity, harmonization, community-driven, and non-for-profit and technology neutral. And everything I think that we do, and some of perhaps the experience, so that's what I would just like to give a few words on what the Research Data Alliance experience in creating these, if you like, large communities are. And we do this, I mean, the Research Data Alliance at the moment has about 12,000 data professionals who work on different challenges. And it's all volunteer and community driven. It's very much a bottom-up organization. And we have 3 mechanisms: interest groups, working groups, and our newly communities of practice, which is very interesting. And of course, I've followed closely the AGU data citation community of practice development. And we too felt that a community of practice was a sort of an evolution of some of the activities within the Research Data Alliance. We have decided to keep it as a domain bar discipline focused area. So for communities of practice, the one that has already launched is around agricultural data. But anyway, so in terms of trust, of course, there's the, you know, the social bridges, the openness, transparency, the relationships aspects. And we have, I have to say, while we've continued to actively work, and the pandemic and going virtual has supported, if you like, or, you know, we haven't seen a fall, if you like, in the work. But we do notice the difference between the connections and the building the connections that were one of the major aspects of our plenary meetings every 6 months. In terms of governance, I suppose we have a very agile, I would say, and lightweight governance, despite the fact that it's such a large organization and it's global. We have 145 different countries represented through our members. The governance goes in terms of we've a series of different layers, which I think are, you know, interesting to take stock of. So an organizational kind of governance, which in fact ESIP is a member of. We have a technical governance because we need advice and support from a technical perspective. We have a regional governance as well, because we do have regional funding, and the, if you like, the coupling of those different layers, the regional perspective, geographical perspective, we feel is very important because of the cultural differences, linguistic differences, and inclusivity from a geographical perspective. And of course, you know, a funder perspective too, who that sits outside of our main governance. Our funders are not actually directly involved. Their choice and something that we feel is a good way. So it's quite inclusive, it's structured, but it's flexible. So that's something I think. And of course, then we have an overarching, if you like, governance for vision and strategy. From a policy perspective, I think there are two aspects I'd probably say. One is that RDA is not a policy body. We actually have a statement on that, but I suppose de facto becomes one because the community are working on areas that are important and do from some perspective or another become, if you like, policy. But on the other part, I mean, possibly more relevant to this discussion is the organizational policy. So, you know, what sort of policies do you need, and how can you manage them in a community of practice or a knowledge commons that you wish to be as inclusive and as open as possible? And I think that we have tested over the years since 2013 many, so we'd be happy to, you know, share with them. And they're actually, all of our documentation and results are open, so everybody is welcome to take advantage of them. A couple of things I think, if I may, not to put the damper on it, but some of the things that we've learned by experience to remember is that when you construct your knowledge commons, and I think it's the same for all, to be aware of the funder and funding priorities and how they, you know, obviously they will change over time. So to understand the overall vision, and also jurisdictional limitations, because if my understanding of your plan for this particular knowledge commons or community of practice or whatever we like to call it, is that it would be global. It doesn't have geographical boundaries. Yeah. So, but there are jurisdictional limitations, some things. But I think that there are many, you know, successful and less successful practices. We have them ourselves and experiences, you know, to learn from. One thing that we do often, and I think you can't do enough of it, as time consuming as it is to co-create and sort of consult a bit with the stakeholders, you know, and remember that people are often the determining factor for the choices that are made at the outset of community-driven, you know, and community-focused initiatives. And that can be, again, a positive or, you know, a negative thing. And the last thing I would say, I suppose, that we have a few things that that still stand today in the Research Data Alliance that could be, you know, useful to take note of. That the guiding principles that we set out have changed by one word since we set out, and we revisit them continuously. And they are central to all the decisions that we make. So any organizational decision that we make, we must bear in mind those guiding principles of openness and things, which is a challenge and becomes a challenge when you talk about funding, when you talk about sustainability, and that, you know, adopting flexible, if you like, models. They have helped us and facilitated us over the years in innovating in our partnerships and being able to introduce new models from a governance, I suppose, perspective. So I'll finish with going back to what Caroline said, and she said, you know, this shared and mutual vision that helps enormously, I think, in maintaining it and, you know, keeping, and you can always revisit it, but ensuring that everyone is sort of on the same page and sharing the vision together can be very, you know, lead to great successes, which I think the Research Data Alliance has, and it is a product of the community. I'm lucky enough to speak on its behalf, but I'm not the one that does the work. That's the huge community that we have. So,
thank you, Hilary. That was a fantastic overview of Research Data Alliance. I know, just from judging from the post-its that are coming up on the Miro board, people are very interested in that. So thank you very much. I'd like to move on to Reid Bohm, who is a research data management librarian at the University of Houston. And Reid, I will hand it over to you and leave your slide up here.
Thank you, Ryan. I can't tell you all how honored I am to be here. I started out at ESIP when I was first in graduate school, and I think this was the first place that I was really exposed to communities of practice, and did some work on mapping the community at that point in time. But over time, working as a data management librarian, I've been able to do a lot of work with communities of practice, and particularly right now, working with a digital research commons, where we do a lot of work with researchers to really engage in these communities of practice around specific skills or specific types of research, especially around interdisciplinary research. So it's very much on the small scale right now, but there were a lot of things that I've encountered that really came up for me as I was thinking about what I know about different communities that are involved with ESIP and what I'm experiencing right now as I'm doing my work. So I'm thinking about 3 significant challenges that are also, I think, essential considerations for working with communities of practice. And so the first one is this concept of governance, which Hillary really alluded to a lot, but the aspect of balance. And this has really been my biggest barrier right now, is to think about, how do we focus on this idea of experimentation and co-discovery and co-development, where you're really letting the group emerge organically and grow to be, by the people, in terms of a way that it can still be structured and functional and rigorous. And it's this constant back and forth. And I constantly ask people, do you have enough space to create and see yourself in this? And that kind of brings me to the second issue that I continue to talk with folks about and continue to encounter, which is negotiating meetings and negotiating your identity within a community of practice. And this idea that we are representing very different voices, very different conceptual understandings of content. And, as individuals working in this group, how are we perceiving ourselves and the meanings that we've developed within this large group, where we all have these very different meanings, even if we're working on the same thing together. And so thinking that it's really imperative to demonstrate to our participants, how they are, finding their own ownership within this space. And so it's really, this iterative dialogue where, you're trying to empower folks to really engage in this interrogation of structures, and that the contribution of the questions that they ask is really what continues to shape and enrich that community. And then the third one, as you can tell, these are kind of all interconnected, really talks about sustained engagement, which I've also heard from folks here so far. And so it's cool to see that we're all kind of on the same page and coming from the same space and these same hurdles that we're working with. But it takes a lot of preparation to make things easy. But that ease of work is really, I feel like, what allows for this greater engagement over time. And so, maintaining that buy-in when we're excited at the beginning, and then, over time, sometimes we get so busy, our ability to participate may wane. But then, how do you then get over that hump and get people to continue to contribute, especially when you're talking about research and sharing materials and things like that? And so my question, and I'd love to hear more about this from folks, is, are there ways to build in contribution and participation that are very automatic? And so it could become part of a workflow or a one-step process to really continue to contribute. So you don't even recognize that you are contributing, except that you see the benefits and you see yourself within that group. So those are my 3 things, and I'm really interested in talking with you all further. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. That's fantastic. I love those 3 dimensions of this, and then also the kind of relationship that you're leading into with the reason we chose, or we've been thinking about this in the terms of a commons, is where it emerged. It kind of comes from this history of a research into natural resource commons like fisheries and grasslands, and the things that you're describing, what is the right level of structure to create flourishing cooperation of those spaces and avoid this, the idea of a tragedy of a commons where there's overuse, things of that nature. That very much bears on the idea of a knowledge commons. It's not, I really appreciate you bringing those concepts up, and I think they're very generative of some of the discussions we'd like to have. So our next panel member is Ian Foster, and Ian Foster represents an entirely new dimension to this conversation. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago, and also a senior researcher at Argonne National Lab. And Ian, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. So I'll just say a few words. So yeah, my interest is in, I mean, I find the knowledge graph stuff fascinating, but I have no more than a passing knowledge of it. Most of my work is focused on sort of building and applying tools that help to reduce friction when you're working with large amounts of data, whether you're acquiring it, aggregating it, or computing on it at scale. So one set of tools that my group develops and operates for people is the Globus tools that people use to move and share large amounts of data. But I've also been involved in the Earth System Grid, which is used to distribute intergovernmental panel on climate change simulation data, and the materials data facility, which collects and distributes large amounts of material science data, not much to do with the Earth system, I guess. And so, you know, I think we're at a time now where the amount of Earth system data and space data that is coming available is enormous. And so it's going to become essential that we put in place machinery that makes it possible for people to ask and answer questions of those large amounts of data, to link data sets from different sources, to you know, enhance data sets, all in ways that scale faster than the amount of data that we have available to us. Just to give an example of why that's so important, I think, is I've recently been engaged with a student and some geophysicists on a project where we're applying unsupervised learning methods to satellite imaging data with the goal of learning cloud classes without predefined assumptions of what they are. And that's something that's possible using modern deep learning methods, deep neural networks, adversarial autoencoder techniques. But to get to the point where we are now, we've spent pretty much a year transferring 500 terabytes of this data from a NASA lab to Argonne. That should be quasi instantaneous, or the data should just be available somewhere where people can operate on it. So we should all be thinking about all sources of friction. So one source of friction relates to, of course, making data findable, accessible, and so forth. But another source relates to making it computable and computable at large scale. Thanks, Brian. That's all I wanted to say.
Excellent, very much. Appreciate that, Ian. We've linked to a couple of your research groups, excellent sets of projects, so appreciate the introduction. Our next speaker, our next panel member is Anaru Prabhu, who is now with the Carnegie Institution for Science. A big congratulations to Anaru on having graduated from RPI with his PhD. And Anaru, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to this session. From what I see here, my charge is to talk about two things in particular. First is my experiences in helping build knowledge graph. And second is my experiences in using knowledge graphs or data to gain scientific insights. So recently I've been much more focused on the latter, but it's been a valuable experience over the years, just getting perspectives from both the data consumer and the data producer, and what connects the two, the science. So a lot of you may be familiar with this, but I'll say it nonetheless. Data producers mostly focus on creating the data resources or linking to existing data resources and sort of simplifying it a little. The main goal there is to create data resources that are widely impactful to the scientific community, are widely useful. On the other end of the spectrum, data consumers are going to be focused on using the data, any kind of data that they can get that helps answer their research questions and gaining knowledge about a certain domain. So in both of these cases, the task is to constantly improve and develop and improve ways that we can achieve these goals. So I'll address a little bit of both, if that's okay. The first thing that I want to say is, if there's one thing I learned from helping build knowledge graphs such that the method that we use, whatever it may be, has to be flexible, iterative, and compartmentalized. So what I mean here is that, yeah, there are a lot of papers out there that talk about knowledge graph construction. There are top-down approaches, bottom-up approaches, and so on. And there are, there's a different case to be made for using each approach. But I think that the important step there is to really start with an iterative use case development. So as mentioned on the slide, Peter Fox is my advisor and mentor, and he used to say use cases are a middle out approach and they're essential. As with anything Peter says, there's like a lot of layers to it. But one takeaway here is that knowledge graphs live and die by their use cases and how well they're documented. So it's these use cases that give us the flexibility and compartmentalization required for us to smoothly build a knowledge graph. And I view the other components in a traditional knowledge graph construction method or approach as sort of puzzle pieces that you can fit in different ways, depending on how you want to approach it, depending on your use case. I also wanted to, as I mentioned, address the data consumer's perspective a little bit. So we know that not everyone in the scientific community can be considered highly data literate. But thanks to communities like ESIP and many of these groups that exist, the situation is rapidly improving. But the additional question to ask is everyone who's data literate also a data enthusiast? And more importantly, in what way? My point here is that not every data user or consumer is motivated by the same goal when they're looking at data sets, trying to find data sets. So incentives for them to use the data, share the data, just be part of this community or the knowledge commons is very different. For example, as a data scientist, I'm currently most excited about solving data problems, about solving big data problems, yes, but also small data problems, sparse data problems. How to create a small or sparse data framework, for example, is something I'm currently working on. Or making algorithmic advances to understand the relationships between data and so on. But the collaborators that I work with at Carnegie and in other institutions, their primary motivations may not be the same as mine. Their primary motivations could be research questions like, how do we find potential biosignatures on certain planets or exoplanets? What roles do minerals play in the evolution of our planet? Anyways, so the point I'm trying to make here is that for a sustainable community or a knowledge commons, my view is that we need to address the motivations of as many actors in this community as possible, thereby reducing some of the gaps that exist in the larger ecosystem between the data consumers and producers. So I think this is a great opportunity here that we have at a community like ESIP, which not only has people who have expertise from either end of the spectrum, but actually has a lot of us who are in the intersection between data producers and consumers. When we participate in the discussion, it really helps bring things into perspective and see who we can involve in this discussion and how to do so. So thank you.
Thank you, Anaru. Really appreciate your perspective on this. And I like that you mentioned this kind of middle out approach that you and Peter had worked on. And I think that's the middle component of that is whether you take a fully automated approach to knowledge graph creation, where you maybe mine with some technology a bunch of literature and emerge some important concepts from that and try and connect them. And then the opposite end of the spectrum, where you start very granularly and you try and identify all the entities and concepts that you can think of, and then by hand build your knowledge graph. I think the use case approach is that middle out approach is really nice. And it points to one of the things I just want to remind people what we'd like to come from this session is to contribute pieces to the PubPub space collection page, because those are going to become the use cases around which this knowledge commons develops. And so I think that's a great starting point for this. So thank you, Anaru. We're going to move on to our final introduction, and that's going to be from Chris Mungall. And I'm extremely excited as well to have Chris a part of this panel. He's a department head for the biosystems data at the Data Science Berkeley Lab. And Chris has deep knowledge in creating knowledge graphs. And I know that he has some thoughts on the knowledge commons as well. Chris, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to you so you can share your one slide.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ryan. And thanks everyone for the great setup there. I feel I don't have so much to talk about now. A lot of what I wanted to say has been covered, which is great. But yeah, so I'm a computational scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I'm actually in the Environmental Genomics and Systems Biology Division. So my interests span the environmental sciences and the life sciences, but my comfort level is definitely much more on the molecular biology side of things rather than the environmental side. So a lot of the work I do involves data integration and integrating data to enable new insights from data. This involves a lot of building of ontologies, knowledge bases, and now, to use the trendier term, knowledge graphs. So I thought I'd kind of just drop a few tips for kind of like successfully building and deploying knowledge graphs based on my own experiences. So the first one I think was really covered nicely by Anaru, and that is really, I think it's really important to be use case driven. It's fantastic to kind of get together a community of practice and also be on the same page about, yeah, let's all get together and build this fantastic knowledge graph. But you've got to have a really clear idea of exactly what it is you're building and why you're building it. What kind of questions are you aiming to answer that couldn't be answered before? And this applies whether you're building knowledge graph to essentially perform kind of like lookup functions, or whether you're trying to use various kind of machine learning techniques such as knowledge graph embedding to do link prediction and so on. It can also be tempting to really over-engineer and over-model and to try and just bring in the entire kind of like universe. But we only have so many resources available to us. So I think it's important to be like really focused on what your use cases are and try and kind of like build something that will cover those. At the same time, kind of like looking to build something that will be extensible to other use cases. So I think one of the projects that I'm a PI on, but predated my involvement, was the Gene Ontology, which was very kind of like focused around even though it attempted a very grand task, which is to represent biological function across the whole tree of life. It was like very focused on a kind of very practical goal, which is like, how do we come up with a vocabulary for being able to describe genes and gene function and propagate that information across species. The other thing I'd say is really important is to think about how the knowledge is structured. And there's a fine line here between imposing too much structure at the outset that will limit your ability to integrate data from kind of other kind of areas, versus being just completely free form and just throwing everything into your knowledge graph and then ending up with this just kind of big stew of kind of like links that no one really knows how to traverse or how to kind of like add things to or how to extract information from. So I think I'd urge you to pay special attention to some kind of like knowledge graph schema, whether you're using kind of shaped languages, or we've developed a tool called like LinkML, which is designed to kind of essentially bridge shaped languages, JSON schema, and ways of kind of like building knowledge graphs for building schemas for our knowledge graphs. An example of that is something we've built called the Biolink Model. This is currently being used to integrate as part of one NIH project for the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, to integrate knowledge graphs from about 20 different kind of groups who are all building different knowledge resources, covering different aspects of molecular biology, and trying to come up with a common schema for all of these. And then no one's really kind of mentioned ontologies so far. But ontologies, however you define them, however you define knowledge graphs, are really a key part of your knowledge graph. And you want to be looking to reusing and building these judiciously. There's a lot of ontologies out there already. You should definitely be looking to reuse and adapt these. Don't reinvent where something exists already. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge it can be hard to use many existing ontologies that are built for one particular purpose, and they may not transfer outside that individual context to other contexts. So I want to point to one ontology in particular, ENVO, the environment ontology that I'm involved with, which is part of a larger effort, a larger community of practice called OBO, the Open Bio Ontologies Foundry, which is a collection, is both like the technical and sociological infrastructure to enable developers of different ontologies to work together to be able to specialize developing ontologies within their own individual areas, but at the same time with a view to making these ontologies piece together to build up essentially the knowledge graph of all of life. I think with that we can move on to questions.
Thank you, Chris. And I posted a link to a presentation that I became aware of that you gave that goes into some more depth on these things. And I think it's really fantastic. So I appreciate that. There's been a number of resources that are already flying around, and I'll be trying to compile those in the notes and the Miro board for everyone beyond the meeting. There are a couple of things that come to mind to me. I want to get quickly to the participant questions, because I think those would be the most valuable in making sure that we have everyone's voice kind of contributing to the discussion. But maybe I'll start it here. There's been a lot of talk about harmonization, whether that's harmonization among different groups that are trying to speak the same language, harmonization over different dictionaries and glossaries. And I also interpret some of what Chris and Anaru said about harmonization among ontologies or the semantic resources that we have. So I'd love it if to just throw the question out about what does harmonization look like in building the knowledge graphs of the knowledge communities that you're a part of. And this is directed broadly to the panel, so I welcome anyone to speak up.
Well, I can talk to you about what it means in it's one of our guiding principles, but from our perspective, it means, I think it could be applied here, is, and part of the governance, I suppose, I have the role, one of the major roles of the technical advisory board or group, if you like, is to watch for harmonization in terms of standards and policies and best practices, and this reinvention of the wheel and things like that, and avoid overlapping. So from I mean, the harmonization in RDA comes from that perspective, if you like. And it is a job, yeah, and it's a job that has to be done, and it's a job that's not that easy. And I think that it was Chris actually who just mentioned the fact that, yeah, you reuse, but oftentimes things aren't actually appropriate for reuse and do need to be built again. So I think the harmonization is both internal and external in this.
I guess I'll go next for the harmonization question. I'm sure there are many in the audience right here who actually know more about this, but ESIP has had group like the Semantic Web group at ESIP has been thinking about and discussing semantic harmonization for quite a while now. So if anyone wants to jump in there, jump in. But it's just the concept that you have in ontologies. When you start off creating your ontologies, you start as a vocabulary, and you want to have these terms there, and you want to define them, and they should mean something. And context is extremely important when you're defining these terms. And when you're really then thinking about reuse in terms of linking your ontology to concepts that already exist somewhere else and are defined slightly differently from yours, or are defined completely differently from yours, you really want to come to you want to agree upon what the term means. Do those relationships still apply in your you have to reconcile with what's out there and what you want to create and meet halfway, and you have to harmonize the meaning of what is this, the data that you're trying to encode, is a short way of putting it, is what I view as semantic harmonization. There's obviously more nuance, but that's just the short version that I want to talk about.
Yeah, so I might, I guess Rob had his hand up.
Rob, do you want to say a quick comment?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so just to follow up on what the last couple of comments were on reuse and harmonization and things like that. Yeah, it's absolutely correct that there will be many cases where you cannot reuse, and in fact, it is not it's not a hard and fast rule, and you're going to find that because ontologies are effectively based on it's based on meaning, you need to really examine what the ontology or even a control vocabulary or otherwise is actually saying, because that might not match what you either desire or intend. It might not be what your data is about. And more than that, some ontologies have with them a lot of baggage associated with the conceptual model behind it. So you may be committing yourself to let's say a worldview or a model that you don't actually agree with. So before you effectively attach meaning or metadata to your data, you should really be looking what you're getting into, what you're committing, what it says about your data, and make sure that it's what you need.
Thank you,
And
Robert.
likewise for harmonization, there's a lot of details in things like mapping and alignment and harmonization that folks may not be aware of. When you get into the weeds, you really need to consider all different layers of abstraction, because you may, in creating a mapping, for instance, or some sort of correspondence, if you don't look at all of the commitments or the nested structure in which terms or entire ontologies are mapped or harmonized, you actually may be committing yourself to a lot more, again, baggage and content than you may want, and it may not be good for your needs.
Thank you, Robert. I think it's a useful perspective. I'm hesitant to get too in the weeds on ontologies during this short session. I think that that's going to be something that obviously is a follow-on full workshop discussion, I think, among us. But I do want to hear some of the panelists weigh in on this harmonization theme. And Chris and Reed both have their hands up. So maybe, Chris, I think you were in line to go next, and then Reed just after. Thank you.
Yeah, I might draw a distinction between what I like to think of as retrospective versus prospective harmonization. At least in the biosciences, we often find ourselves needing to harmonize after the fact, whether it's harmonized, multiple ontologies or multiple databases. And, it's not atypical to see something like a concept such as Parkinson's disease of 40 different identifiers in 40 different database systems. And some of those, were built for different purposes, and there is work to be done in reconciling the different contexts in which they were built. If it was built for a rare disease database versus a neurodegenerative disease database, then that has impact on the meaning. But nevertheless, what we've tended to find is that it is a tractable task to be able to kind of harmonize these concepts and data models by generalizing across them. It almost always turns out to be less expensive to do this prospectively, and to not get into a situation whereby 5 years after the fact you realize that you've got 20 different groups doing essentially the same thing, and instead try and kind of work together from the outset to build common standards, common sets of entities and entity identifiers, common sets of edge labels for building your knowledge graphs. And it can be harder, because you do have to deal with this issue of different contexts, different ontological commitments. But I'd say it's definitely worth the effort to do that.
This is a really an interesting idea in terms of how it relates to this understanding of negotiating meaning among people, and how we see ourselves within a community, and how we our worldviews get represented, or our understandings of the field get represented. And I don't, it's not something where there's, from my lack of systems perspective, and in building ontologies and relationships, but I am always so curious about whether there are situations where things can be flexible, or where things can be represented in ways that don't require necessarily verbal understandings of things. And it's it's hard to know what that would be or what it would be like, but I always think about that, is there a way to document how it shifts? So I don't have a lot of answers or anything like that, and it's not very functional to think like that all the time. But this idea that of being inclusive within a system, I think, is just a huge hurdle to overcome.
Thank you, Reed. It leads into something that's emerging in the Miro board, and something that's present on my mind as well. I think a lot of the speakers mentioned this, is the need to be user-centered or use case-centered. And I'd love to hear from each of the panelists how you do that in your projects. What does that look like? I know we have some differing perspectives on this. Maybe we can start with Ian, and how you design computational platforms. How do you allow the user or the intended scientist to kind of inform how you develop those?
Oh, that's a great question. So I often, in these contexts, I often think of the late Jim Gray, when he was designing databases, and he said he would try and get people to tell them the 20 questions they wanted to be able to ask of a database. So what are the, and then that would help them, decide what was important. And I think that applies in many contexts. What is it? Of course, people want to do all sorts of things, but if you ask them to come up with the 20 most important questions they want to be able to ask, that will help you prioritize your effort, whether it's in data harmonization or algorithm optimization or data organization or whatever it might be.
Thank you, Ian. I think for those knowledge graph modelers out there, the idea of those 20 questions is going to spring the connection to competency questions. But I will hand it over to the other panelists for thoughts.
I'd like to just jump in with a little bit more maybe color to that refrain oft repeated that we have to know what the database needs to deliver. Very true. And if we're thinking about how to design towards, the things that Reid is bringing up and the ideas of the knowledge commons, which are action support, the user themselves, how do we build into our user interfaces the methodologies that allow them to actually take care of the graph and put data into it repeatedly. Those two are things that can be constructed into the graph and should be considered beyond just what is the graph producing in terms of its information. What does it also need to structurally support in terms of allowing people to use it in the design process?
Anaru, please feel free. Chime in.
So thanks, Ryan. So I just wanted to give you examples and experience from my experiences, right? The first is, so there are two types of sort of knowledge graph creations, or two types of scenarios where we end up creating knowledge graphs. And you were asking about the use cases and the competency questions part, right? The first one is where there is a project where your goal is to create that knowledge graph for whatever it's being used for, whether it's being used for smart search, whether it's being used for a question answering system or something like that. And in that case, it's very clear. You start with the 20 questions, like Ian mentioned, or competency questions, also is what we call it in the lab where I was doing my PhD, right? Deb McGuinness really likes the competency questions, and you'd sit down and try to define your competency questions, and those competency questions would run your use cases. But the second type of knowledge graph or information model or ontology that emerges is the interesting point that I wanted to mention, which is that many of the projects that I work with, the collaborators are interested in answering their science questions. They're not very invested in, whether that's a knowledge graph, whether that's just the database, whether that's a data set, whether that's an Excel file. They want to get to the scientific insights. And not everything needs to go through a knowledge graph for you to eventually be able to use, supervised methods, unsupervised methods, predictive, prescriptive, descriptive models, and so on. So in those cases, we actually like to keep things more flexible. So you start by exploring the research, exploring the data in a more traditional analytics using analytics methods. And once you eventually reach a point where you're trying to link to many of these such data sets, there comes a time where you start discussing your information model. And there you start your, conceptual model, logical model, physical model discussions as you're looking at your information model. And I don't like to use the word that it organically comes a time, but there does come like a time where it's important to then step back and link all the data sets that you've been using to get to the next step with your scientific exploration. And that's when you can go to your collaborators and say, look, I think there's a need for this to be done. So let's do this now. And you can already see, where we can get with this process. So that's the second type that I really wanted to mention. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anaru. Reid, Hillary, would you like to add anything? Chris?
Only that, yeah, I really agree with the 20 questions, competency questions approach. I'd also stress it's really important to make these actionable questions. You know, I love brainstorming with scientists where we kind of talk about things that we can do with, if we bring all this knowledge together, like understand the nature of ecological shifts and so on. But it's important to take some of these big overarching scientific questions and break them down into something that you could actually answer, and you have a strategy for being able to answer, whether it's using statistical methods or lookups or machine learning or anything else.
That's very important, Chris. Thanks. Reed, Hillary.
To speak to Chris's point, I'm very curious when you think about like the aspect of analytics and trying to discover what's, you know, kind of predominant, you know, how much does what is being shared within a community dictate how the relationships are being built? And I guess that's kind of a question that I have as an outsider saying, what would that be like? And is that even possible?
I'd say yes, you're very much bound by the kinds of information that is being shared, and you've got all the attendant problems of data bias and so on there. And you need to have strategies for dealing with those as well, whether it's, you know, the open world assumption or statistical methods.
If I can just jump in here from a less technical perspective, you know, I think that when you think about what a community is sharing, that could be a lot of different things, right? Data sets or experiences, activities, conversations, cultural beliefs. There's lots of different sharing that we have to think about. But at the core of all of these sort of approaches is some kind of structural organization, right? There is something that is being shared, and there are some things that need to be supported with various types of information. The competency questions that the technical folks start with is really a representation, sort of a photograph of what those structures are. If we think about it from a design perspective, from the cultural and community side, we need to think about what those same structures are in our groups and how to sort of emerge those through, you know, the kinds of activities that Caroline was discussing, this emergent collaboration. You know, what are the intersection points that have enough energy around them that folks want to build communal systems together that could then support competency questions and a bigger system and these kinds of things.
Thank you, Ellie. And I think, SA, you put an excellent question in the chat as well, which is, how do you allow the people using the resource or the structure that Ellie is talking about to kind of feed back into that and have it be evolvable, which I think is really an important component of the commons. I recognize that we're running a bit short on time, and I think there are a lot of useful threads here that we're going to continue to pull on. And I'll just reiterate that this is going to be kind of a step one of these discussions, and the people that are involved here, make sure you have your name put in the notes document, because this is how we'll understand who wants to be involved in these conversations moving forward. I think what we're going to do is now move to the final portion of the session. The first thing I want to do is take the next 2 minutes and have people go to the Miro board and just think back on some of the things that we've been discussing and put in kind of your most potent takeaways, the things that you're going to be thinking about, or things that stick out to you during this discussion. So I'm just going to let it be open and let people think for just a moment for the next couple of minutes while we put our thoughts into the Miro board. And then again, these will go in the emergent questions or ideas, which will seed the follow-on activities that we'll do. And so we'll kind of conclude that portion here at 5:20 Eastern time, and then we'll jump into the call to action portion of the session. Okay, thank you, everyone. I would love to have many more hours to discuss with each of our panel members some of these things. We'll save that for future conversations. I want to move to the final part, which is kind of calling to action. Again, moving from communities of interest to communities of practice, and how do we do that? We're very fortunate to have Claudia Pozzo from the Who's Knowledge Group, who's the communications co-lead from that group, joining us today. And she's going to help transition into this kind of call to action component. She has some really unique skill sets in terms of designing and building communities and integrating that with digital technologies, global data commons, among other things. So Claudia, I will hand it over to you, and I believe I will be sharing your slides. So let me pull those up here. And if you're ready, I will hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. I hope my audio is working well. Let me know if it's not. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claudia. Thank you for the introduction, Ryan. I am a brown Latin woman, originally from Bolivia, where I am located at the moment. I am, of course, a Spanish speaker. I am a digital rights activist and a feminist. I also support and work with different communities across Latin America, from indigenous movements to tech collectives. At the moment, I am communications co-lead at Whose Knowledge, a multilingual global campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities online. So I have to start by saying that it has been truly an inspiring set of conversations. This is really the first time I share space with a set of scientists and academics like all of you. So thank you for inviting me. So we have been talking on a lot, and also I saw a few notes on the Miro board about how to share information openly, how to create a community of practice around that. But I want to take a step back, and I want to talk about decolonization and epistemic justice in the process of creating formal knowledge. And for that, very quickly, I want to bring into the table a few core elements of our work at Whose Knowledge that I think may fit differently in the various fields of expertise of all of you. And I hope at the end, they will serve as a provocation and as an invitation for reimagining and reframing some of the work we are all doing. So in the next slide, we are going to start by remembering that the most crucial infrastructure that allows us to share knowledge is the internet, of course. Most of the world is online today. I think about 60% of the global population is online. And from those people online, 75% are from the global south. Yet, primarily white men from the global north, especially Europe and North America, are the ones building and governing the internet. Next slide, please. In other words, the infrastructures of the internet does not look or sound like most of us in the world. And that is the door of a variety of knowledge injustices. Let's start with languages. At Whose Knowledge, we understand language as a proxy for knowledge. And that is because to exist in a language is completely different from doing so in a different one. When I think and do and be in Spanish, I am inhabiting the world in a different way than when I am thinking and doing and being in English. Also, we know there are more than 7,000 languages in the world, yet most online content, and by that I mean websites, are in English. Most scholarly publications are also in English. Most scientific journals and social science journals in the main digital libraries are also in English. And I say that because at Whose Knowledge, we are working on a report on the state of the languages on the internet, which we are going to release at the end of February. So I invite you all to stay tuned for that one. But in general, we can say the internet is highly monolingual, which means that it is also highly monoculture. So the next slide, please. And that is one reason why we must think about how to decolonize knowledge and how to decolonize the internet. Because these bias on languages and many other issues are not accident. They come from colonization and its remaining and ongoing structures of power and privilege. And please, next slide. And this leads us to one key piece of our work, we at whose knowledge are rooted in a power analysis. When we think about power, we recognize that in any context, from the individual to the community and to the system, we constantly have to ask ourselves who does what, who gets what, who sets the agenda, who decides what. Next slide, please. And that power framing leads me to this other key piece of our work at whose knowledge, which is knowledge justice and reparations. So how do we at whose knowledge think about this? How do we approach it? Next slide, please. We start with the radical notion that people are knowledges. And this is also a feminist approach to data, to value multiple forms of knowledge, including the knowledge that comes from people as living, feeling bodies in the world. Next, please. So to explain that very quickly, I am going to refer to Michael Polanyi, a Hungarian British physical scientist, who talked about tacit knowledge, what we call here embodied knowledge, and how it becomes formal or disembodied knowledge. So what he said was that when we create artifacts from embodied knowledge, that allows us to claim a formality to it. That is to say, those artifacts allow us to claim institutional authority. Next one, please. So for instance, we have an example here. We have the photo of Maria Sabina, who was a Mazatec indigenous healer from the Sierra Mazateca in Oaxaca, Mexico. Maria Sabina made healing ceremonies using sacred mushrooms, including psilocybin mushrooms. And long story short, one day, Gordon Wasson, an American ethnomycologist, came over to her house and recorded her sessions. And through that process, Maria Sabina's knowledge became institutionalized. And this is important because this is the process through which we are constructing a system of formal knowledge artifacts that have institutional authority. In these processes, what is key for us at whose knowledge is to ask ourselves, who in the world has the power and resources to create these forms of formal knowledge artifacts? And what does it mean for the different communities whose knowledges need to be translated, interpreted, and more often than not, co-opted in order to be considered formal knowledge? We opened today's session with Ellie mentioning climate change in relation to knowledge graphs. And I want to go back to that and quickly remind us that indigenous knowledge and epistemologies across the world are continuously overlooked and romanticized in the global discussions of climate change, partly because they are not considered formal knowledge by policymakers. So next slide, please. So on that spirit, the final thought I will bring through this image of Berta Cáceres, an indigenous leader, a feminist, an environmental activist from Honduras who was assassinated back in 2016 for defending Lenca land and territory, is that we at whose knowledge recognize that the work that lies ahead is of knowledge reparations and justice, and not representation and solutionism. This means that it is not only about who is online and what are the knowledge gaps that we need to fill up, but it's about recognizing that we need to do better and that we need to think from different positions and systems of knowledge and ask ourselves, how do we make sure that epistemic justice is centered at the moment of creating knowledge? So I'm going to leave you all with that question. Thank you for having me. In the next slide, you can see our social media handle and website if you would like to connect further with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you to our participants. Thank you to our conveners. Thank you to our panel members. I want to take just a final 2 minutes if people can hang on. If you have to hop to another meeting, I understand. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris for quick comments about calls to action from this session. I do want to reiterate that this is just the beginning of these conversations, and I think everyone's given us important things to think about. So Chris, over to you.
Yeah, just quickly so I'm Chris Erdman at the American Geophysical Union. I'm also a librarian, and so a lot of this relates to similar to what Carolyn said about her story, that I've been involved in building some of these knowledge graphs in the past, and one of the difficult parts to starting out was finding the groups of people, the projects that were happening, the initiatives, the use cases. We talked about sort of the use cases out there to learn from the work from other people was particularly difficult. We had to go out and look at different projects, talk to them individually. And so one of the things that would be great as far as building a community of practice is, enabling something like that for groups that are trying to start a project. But also, one of the other aspects that's been mentioned here is the participation aspect. So we've had a thread in the chat as far as like the technology barriers, the barriers as far as participating in these, in creating knowledge graphs. And that's something also that we maybe be able to help break down and allow people to participate in knowledge graphs. And so in general, this is a call to action to build a community of practice. And if you know of other groups that we can bring together, that would be great. Let us know some of the resources that are out there. Also yourselves on the call. But also, one other point I'd like to make to bring this to sort of conclusion is one of the other aspects that's been particularly hard to realize is FAIR. The knowledge, connecting knowledge graphs in FAIR, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Really, users are having still a difficult time to use knowledge graphs, and so that's another thing of another part of this call to action is, are we moving towards a convergence point? So that we can enable, users, the community to really use knowledge graphs, use the work that we've been doing. And, there have already been great strides through initiatives or projects like DataCite, or, other infrastructure projects like Wikidata was also mentioned. So are we moving to a convergence point? And maybe, I think Hillary left, but maybe we can do something before RDA as far as a convergence point. But just leaving it that sort of concluding remarks with all of you. And if you wanted to follow up, you have access to all the documents, all the notes, and feel free to reach out to Ryan as well if you'd like to participate.
Thank you, Chris. Perfect way to tie up the session. I'll thank everyone again and let you get back to your days or evenings or mornings, wherever you are in the world. This has been a really generative discussion, and I hope that you will help strengthen the network that we created here, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan.
Special thank you to our panelists. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.